Welcome to a nightmare that began on an ordinary day with the best of intentions. The car hummed along the coastal highway, a tiny metal shell against the vast grey expanse of the sea. Inside, the mood was anything but grey. Laughter, sharp and bright, punctuated the low thrum of the engine and the classic rock spilling from the speakers. It was the easy, unthinking laughter of old friends who had finally escaped the city for a much-needed weekend. Leo drove, his hands resting lightly on the wheel. He was the planner, the organizer, the one who found the obscure rental listing for a place called the Saltgrim. He had sold it to them with promises of bracing sea air, dramatic cliffs, and absolute blissful isolation. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no distractions, he had pitched, and they had all eagerly agreed, desperate for a genuine disconnect. Beside him, Maya scrolled through the rapidly dwindling photo gallery on her phone, a skeptical arch to her eyebrow. "Are you sure this place is even real, Leo? The pictures looked like they were taken in 1970. On a potato. That is called vintage charm," Leo shot back without taking his eyes off the winding road. "It is authentic, an old lighthouse keeper's cottage. Think of the history, the atmosphere." In the back, Chloe stared out the window, her reflection a pale ghost against the blur of passing cypress trees. She was quieter than the others, more prone to observing than participating. The coastline, while beautiful, struck her as mournful. The waves did not so much crash as they sighed against the shore, a long, weary exhalation. She pulled her cardigan tighter around herself, a chill crawling over her skin that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Ben, sprawled next to her and surrounded by an explosion of snack food wrappers, was oblivious. Atmosphere is just another word for creepy, dude. As long as the roof does not leak and the beds do not have weird stains, I am good. Hey, pass the chips. The last vestiges of civilization fell away an hour later. The highway narrowed into a two-lane road, then a single lane pocked with potholes. The trees grew thicker, their branches knitting together overhead, plunging the car into a premature twilight. The radio, which had been crackling for the last 20 minutes, finally gave up, dissolving into a hiss of static that Leo clicked off with an annoyed sigh. "Almost there," he announced, his voice a little too loud in the sudden silence. "We just have to pass through the town of Port Blossom." Port Blossom was less a town and more a scar. A handful of buildings huddled together as if for warmth, their paint peeling, their windows dark and vacant like the eyes of skulls. A single gas station stood with its pumps shrouded in faded blue tarps. A general store had a sign that read "closed," in letters so faded they were barely legible. There were no people on the sidewalks, no cars parked along the street. The place felt not just empty but evacuated. "Charming," Maya deadpanned, breaking the tense silence. "Looks like the kind of place you would stop for gas and end up as a lampshade in someone's basement." Ben snorted, but Chloe felt another shiver trace its way down her spine. As they rolled slowly past the general store, she saw a flicker of movement in the grimy front window. A face, pale and gaunt, with dark, She was just standing there, absolutely still, watching their car pass. Her lips were a thin, bloodless line. As Chloe watched, the woman raised a single, trembling hand and drew a slow line across her own throat. It was not a threat, it was a warning. Chloe gasped, whipping her head around to keep the window in view. But the woman was gone. "What is it?" Leo asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Nothing," Chloe mumbled, her heart hammering against her ribs. I thought I saw someone." She did not mention the gesture. They would call her paranoid. They would say she was letting the gloomy atmosphere get to her. Maybe they were right. The road out of Port Blossom was even worse, a gravel track that clawed its way up the side of a cliff. The sea, now far below, was a churning cauldron of slate-grey water. Fog began to roll in, thick and suffocating, clinging to the car and reducing visibility to a few feet. Leo leaned forward, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his earlier confidence evaporating into nervous concentration. Finally, a shape emerged from the mist. At first, it was just a dark smudge, but it slowly resolved into a squat, stone cottage and the thick, cylindrical base of a lighthouse, the Saltgrim. It was more grim than salt. The cottage was smaller than the pictures had suggested, and far more weathered. The stone walls were slick with green moss, and the roof sagged in the middle like a broken back. The lighthouse itself was a crumbling stone stump, its top lantern long gone, replaced by a jagged crown of broken glass and rusted metal. The entire property was perched precariously on the edge of the cliff with no fence or barrier to prevent a careless step from ending in a long fall to the rocks below. The air was thick with the smell of brine and damp decay, but there was another scent underneath it, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old pennies and wilting flowers. "Home sweet home," Ben said, his voice lacking its usual cheer. "It is rustic," Maya offered, though her expression said something else entirely. Leo killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, broken only by the distant rhythmic boom of the surf against the cliffs and the mournful cry of a single gull. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, a waiting silence. "The key is supposed to be under a loose stone by the back door," Leo said, forcing a note of normalcy into his voice as he opened his door. They retrieved their bags from the trunk, their movements slow and strangely hesitant, as if they were intruders in a place that did not welcome them. The fog swirled around their ankles, cold and damp. Leo circled the small cottage. Guys, there is no loose stone." They joined him at the back of the house, which faced the sheer drop of the cliff. The ground was a patch of weeds and packed dirt. There were plenty of stones, but all of them were firmly embedded in the earth. They spent 10 minutes kicking at rocks and running their hands along the base of the damp wall, their fingers coming away cold and gritty. "No key. You have got to be kidding me," Maya said, frustration sharpening her tone. "Did you bring us all the way out here to a locked house in the middle of nowhere?" The owner was very specific, Leo insisted, pulling his phone out, then remembering. "No service." Damn it! It was Chloe who found it. She had wandered over to the front of the cottage, her eyes drawn to a stunted, leafless tree that grew near the door. its branches twisted into arthritic claws. Something was hanging from one of the lower branches, directly over the doorway. A piece of twine, swaying almost imperceptibly in the still air, and at the end of it, a single, heavy, iron key. It looked disturbingly like a miniature noose. "Leo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He saw it, and his face paled. "Oh, that is not where he said it would be." Ben, ever the pragmatist, reached up and untied it. "Well, at least we can get in. I need a bathroom like you would not believe." He pushed the key into the lock. It turned with a grating shriek of rusted metal that set Chloe's teeth on edge. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, opening into a yawning darkness. The air that billowed out was colder than the air outside, and it carried that same strange, sweet metallic scent, only stronger now. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed for a very long time. They stepped inside, one by one, into the main living space. It was a single, large room that combined a kitchen and sitting area. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, sparkling in the beams of their phone flashlights. The furniture was sparse and heavy, a lopsided wooden table with 4 mismatched chairs, a threadbare sofa facing a great stone fireplace, and a few empty bookshelves. The floor was made of wide, dark planks, warped and uneven. Everything was coated in a fine layer of salt spray that had somehow worked its way inside, making the surfaces feel gritty and slick. While Ben located the bathroom and Maya began an unenthusiastic search for a light switch, Chloe's attention was caught by something on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was a collection of objects, arranged in a neat line. A seagull's feather, a small pile of sea-smoothed glass, a child's worn leather shoe, and a tarnished silver locket. It felt like a shrine. Hesitantly, she reached out and picked up the locket. It was cold, to the touch, unnaturally so. She fumbled with the clasp and it sprang open. There were no pictures inside. The spaces where tiny portraits should have been were empty, but the silver behind them was scratched and blackened, as if the images had been violently gouged out. She snapped it shut, her hand trembling slightly, and placed it carefully back on the mantel. "Found a switch," Maya announced triumphantly. There was a click, and a single, bare bulb hanging from the center of the ceiling flickered to life, casting a weak, jaundiced glow over the room. The light did not make the space feel more welcoming. It only served to deepen the shadows in the corners and highlight the grime and decay. Leo was attempting to get a fire going in the hearth, bundling old newspapers from a stack beside it. "Well, once we get a fire going and unpack, it will be cozy." He sounded like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. The cottage had 2 small bedrooms and a narrow staircase leading up to a loft. Chloe and Maya claimed the bedrooms, while the men opted for the loft. Chloe's room contained little more than a rusty iron bed frame and a thin, lumpy mattress. The single window was crusted with salt and looked out at the blank wall of the lighthouse base. As she set her bag down, she noticed something on the windowsill. It was a row of smooth grey stones. They were arranged in a perfect spiral, coiling in on itself like a serpent. She felt a prickle of unease. It was just a pattern, probably left by a previous tenant, but it felt deliberate, intentional. She resisted the urge to scatter them. They spent the next hour in a forced pantomime of a fun weekend getaway. They unpacked their food, wiped down the dusty table, and opened a bottle of wine. Leo managed to coax a sullen, smoky fire to life in the hearth. Ben put a portable speaker on the table and filled the cottage with cheerful, upbeat music that sounded jarringly out of place. However, the chill of the house seeped into their bones. It was a damp, pervasive cold that the fire could not touch. The windows rattled in their frames, even though there was no wind. The floorboards overhead creaked and groaned with a rhythmic regularity, as if someone were pacing back and forth in the empty loft, even when Leo and Ben were downstairs. Maya, ever the rational one, tried to explain it away. "It is an old house on a cliff. It is going to make noise. It is just the wind and the house settling." "There is no wind," Chloe said quietly, looking at the smoke from the chimney, which was rising straight up into the fog. Maya just shrugged and poured herself more wine. As dusk began to bleed through the fog, turning the world outside into an indistinguishable grey blur, the unsettling details continued to accumulate. Ben found a child's drawing tucked inside one of the kitchen cabinets. It was drawn in black crayon on yellowed paper. It depicted a stick-figure family, a man, a woman, and a child, standing in front of the cottage and lighthouse. But there was another figure in the drawing, standing behind the family. It was tall and unnaturally thin, with long spindly arms that reached almost to the ground. It had no face, just a smooth, blank oval for a head. He showed it to the others. "Creepy, right?" Kid had a weird imagination. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was strained. Leo took the drawing and, after a moment's hesitation, crumpled it up and tossed it into the fire. They watched it curl and blacken, the faceless figure the last thing to be consumed by the flames. Later, while looking for a corkscrew, Chloe opened a drawer and found it filled with dozens of birds' nests, all meticulously preserved. They were empty, but perfect, delicate cups of woven twigs and grass and mud. It was strange, but what was truly disturbing was the single strand of long black human hair woven into each and every one. She slammed the drawer shut, a wave of nausea rolling through her. They ate dinner in near silence, the forced cheerfulness of their arrival completely gone, replaced by a tense, unspoken anxiety. The music from the speaker had long since died, its battery drained. Now the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the distant moan of the sea, and the house's incessant groans. There was another sound too, a faint dripping, drip, drip, drip. It was a slow, steady, maddening rhythm. "Is that the kitchen sink?" Leo asked, getting up to check. He twisted the faucet handle. The dripping continued, unchanged. "Bathroom." Ben went to check the bathroom. The toilet was not running. The shower was not dripping, yet the sound persisted, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Again, drip, drip. They tried to ignore it, but the sound wormed its way into their brains, a tiny, persistent drumbeat of wrongness. The fire was dying down, and the chill in the room was growing more intense. They huddled closer to the hearth, shoulders hunched, wine glasses clutched in their hands. "I do not like this place," Chloe said suddenly, her voice trembling. "It feels wrong. Can we just leave? We can drive back to the main road, find a motel." "Do not be ridiculous," Maya said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "We have just gotten here. We are all just tired and a little spooked by the fog. It will be better in the morning. Sunshine changes everything." But would there be sunshine? The fog outside was a solid, impenetrable wall. It felt like the world beyond the cottage had ceased to exist. It was then that they heard the new sound. It was not the house groaning or the water dripping. It was a scrape, a long, slow, dragging sound. It came from outside, from the front of the house. Scrape, drag, scrape. They all froze, eyes wide, looking at each other in the dim, flickering firelight. "What was that?" Ben whispered. "Probably just a branch scraping against the wall," Leo said, his voice tight. Scrape, drag. It sounded heavier than a branch. It sounded like something being dragged across the gravel, something heavy. They sat in breathless silence for a full minute. The scraping stopped. Nothing. The quiet that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself. Leo finally let out a shaky breath and stood up. "I am going to go look." "No," Chloe said, grabbing his arm. "Do not, please." "I am just going to look through the window," he said, gently prying her fingers off. "Stay here." He crept over to the single window beside the front door, which looked out onto the gravel path. He wiped a small circle clean of condensation and peered out into the soupy grey. The others watched him, their bodies rigid with tension. His back was to them, but they saw his shoulders stiffen. He stood there for a long time, completely still. "Leo?" Maya asked, her voice a strained whisper. "What do you see?" He did not answer for a moment. When he finally turned around, his face was as white as bone china. All the forced optimism, all the rational explanations had been stripped away, leaving only raw, naked fear. "There is a line," he said, his voice hoarse. Someone drew a line in the gravel, all the way around the cottage." "A line?" Ben asked, confused. "What kind of line?" Leo swallowed hard. "It is not drawn, it is dug, like with a shovel or a finger. A deep line in the dirt and gravel. It circles the whole house, a line, a boundary, to keep something out, or to keep something in." Before anyone could process this, Chloe, who was standing nearest the staircase, let out a small, strangled cry. She was staring up at the dark opening to the loft. "The door," she whispered, pointing with a trembling finger. "The door to the lighthouse." They all turned to look. The door in question was at the back of the living area, a heavy oak door set into the stone wall that connected the cottage to the base of the lighthouse. When they had first arrived, Ben had tried it and found it locked with a massive, ancient, rust-eaten padlock. He had tugged on it, and it had not budged. Now, in the gloom, they could all see it. The padlock was still there. It was still closed, but the door was open. It was open just a crack, a sliver of profound, impenetrable darkness, a low, cold breeze, smelling of wet stone and something else, something foul and ancient, snaked out from the opening, extinguishing the last embers of the fire and plunging the room into near total darkness. The only light was the weak yellow bulb overhead. From the sliver of blackness, a sound emerged. It was not the wind. It was not the house settling. It was the faint, unmistakable sound of a child humming a nursery rhyme. The humming was thin and reedy, a child's simple tune wandering through the sudden, profound silence. It was a melody with no recognizable words, yet it was deeply, ancestrally familiar, the kind of lullaby one might hear in a nightmare. It coiled out from the black slice of the open lighthouse door, a thread of sound that seemed to physically push the cold, foul air into the room. For 5 eternal seconds, no one moved. They were a tableau of fear, carved from the gloom. Ben's hand, which had been reaching for a log for the fire, was frozen in mid-air. Maya's wine glass was tilted, a single drop of red hanging from the rim like a bead of blood. Leo stood with his back pressed against the far wall, his face a mask of disbelief. Chloe, who had seen it first, had her arms wrapped around herself, her knuckles white, as if holding her own body together. The humming continued, clear and unbroken. It was a lonely sound, devoid of joy or comfort. It was the sound of something repeating a task it had performed for a very, very long time. "Shut it," Maya whispered, her voice cracking. "Leo, shut the door." Leo did not move. He seemed incapable of it. His eyes were locked on that sliver of absolute black. It was Ben who broke the spell. With a curse spat through his teeth, he stomped across the room. His steps, usually so heavy and confident, were loud and clumsy on the warped floorboards. Each footfall was a defiance against the terror that held the rest of them captive. "It is just the wind," he said, the words a hollow echo of Maya's earlier rationalizations. "It is the wind whistling through the cracks up top, making a weird noise." He reached the lighthouse door. The humming did not falter. It seemed to grow a little louder, a little closer, as if the singer were just on the other side, waiting for him. He grabbed the edge of the heavy oak panel, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before he slammed it shut. The boom echoed in the small cottage like a gunshot. The humming was cut off mid-note. The silence that rushed back in was worse. It was heavier now, filled with the ghost of the sound, the memory of the melody. Ben fumbled with the giant rusted padlock, trying to fit the hasp back into place, but his hands were shaking too badly. "It will not," he stammered. "The lock is busted," his bravado crumbling. He rattled it for effect, but it was useless. The mechanism inside had clearly been shattered when the door was forced open. "It was locked," Chloe said, her voice small and distant. "We all saw it." "Ben, you checked it yourself." "I know," he snapped, his fear turning to anger. He gave the door a final frustrated shove. "I know I did." They all stared at the door, the closed, unlocked door. It was no longer a barrier. It was just a suggestion, a courtesy. "What do we do?" Leo asked, his voice shaking. He looked from face to face, his gaze pleading. He was supposed to be the leader, the one who had planned this idyllic retreat. Now he looked like a lost child. "We need to barricade it," Maya said, her mind clicking back into a practical, analytical mode. It was her defense mechanism. The big table. We push it against the door. And the sofa. It was something to do. An action. A way to fight back against the creeping helplessness. Together, they grunted and shoved the heavy, lopsided table across the room, its legs scraping horribly against the floor. They wedged it against the lighthouse door. Then they manhandled the musty, threadbare sofa and pushed it up against the table. It was not a fortress, but it was something. A physical manifestation of their denial. They stood back, breathing heavily, their bodies slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the exertion. The room felt smaller, more cluttered, more like a trap. For 1 hour, they existed in a state of suspended terror. They did not talk. They sat huddled on the floor, as far from the barricaded door as possible, watching it. Every creak of the cottage, every sigh of the sea made them flinch. The dripping sound had stopped. The house was unnervingly quiet, as if holding its breath. They were waiting for the humming to start again. It did not. The silence stretched, thinning their nerves until they felt they might snap. "This is insane," Ben said finally, his voice raspy. He ran his hands through his hair, his movements jerky. "We are acting like we are in some kind of horror movie. It was the wind. The lock was just old and rusted, and the pressure from the wind popped it open. We are letting this place get to us." "And the humming?" Chloe asked softly. "I told you, wind whistling through a crack. You can get weird harmonics, musical notes, anything." He was talking quickly, the words tumbling over each other. He was trying to build a wall of logic around himself, but the foundation was cracked, and the line drawn around the house. Leo added, his voice barely audible. Ben did not have an answer for that. He just shook his head, looking away. It was Maya who voiced the thought that was slithering in the back of all their minds. "We have to know," she said, her eyes fixed on the barricade. "We cannot just sit here all night waiting. We have to know what is in there." "No," Chloe said immediately. "No, we do not. We know enough. We know we should not be here. We should just wait for morning and get out. What if we cannot?" Maya shot back. "What if that door opens again, and we do not know what is coming through it? I would rather face it now than be woken up by it standing over my bed." The image she painted hung in the air, grotesque and terrifyingly plausible. A tense, bitter argument followed. Leo and Chloe were firmly against touching the door. Maya, supported by a reluctant but agitated Ben, argued that the unknown was worse than the known. They needed to see what they were dealing with to understand the threat. Maya's logic, born of sheer terror, eventually won. The alternative, cowering in the dark and waiting for the inevitable, was somehow more terrifying than a direct confrontation. With a sense of grim ceremony, they dismantled their pathetic barricade, their movements slow and deliberate. Every scrape of the sofa felt like a surrender. When they finally pulled the table away, The door stood before them again, inert and silent. It looked ancient and impossibly heavy. "Phone lights," Ben commanded, pulling out his own. "Everyone, let us get as much light on it as we can." 3 shaky beams of bluish-white light converged on the door. Leo fumbled with his phone, his hands trembling too much to activate the flashlight. Ben took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling in a ragged rhythm. He placed his hand on the cold iron handle. He pulled. The door swung inward with a low, deep groan that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the foundation. It opened into a darkness so complete that their powerful phone lights seemed to be swallowed by it just a few feet in. The smell that rolled out was the one they had sensed before, but 100 times stronger. It was the smell of a forgotten cellar, of deep, wet earth, of decay, and something else, a faint, sharp scent, like ozone after a lightning strike. They peered into the abyss. The beams of light cut through the dark, revealing the base of the lighthouse. It was a circular room, perhaps 15 feet across, with a floor of damp-packed earth. The curved walls were made of massive, weeping stones. In the center of the room, a spiral staircase made of rusted iron began its ascent into the oppressive blackness above. There was nothing else in the room. No furniture, no objects, no child. "See," Ben said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Nothing. It is empty." But it did not feel empty. It felt occupied. It felt like they were being watched from the top of that dark staircase. "Let us just close it," Leo pleaded. "We have looked. There is nothing there." "We have to check upstairs," Maya insisted, her voice tight but determined. She shone her light up the staircase, but the beam was eaten by the darkness. The sound came from somewhere. "No way," Leo said, shaking his head. "Absolutely not." "I will go," Ben said, stepping through the doorway. His feet made a soft squelching sound on the damp earth floor. "You guys wait here. I will just go up a little way." He started to climb, his heavy footsteps clanging on the iron stairs. Each step was a loud, percussive bang that reverberated through the cottage. Maya, after a moment's hesitation, followed him. "I am not waiting down here alone." Leo was torn. He was terrified of the lighthouse, but the thought of being left behind with only Chloe, who seemed to be sinking into a state of silent shock, was equally frightening. With a small, choked sob, he followed Maya, his phone light dancing manically on the stone walls. Chloe stayed in the doorway, a sentinel between the relative safety of the cottage and the encroaching dread of the lighthouse. She would not go in. She could not. It felt like stepping into a throat. She watched their lights ascend, growing smaller and smaller, a constellation of 3 nervous stars moving up into the black. She could hear their ragged breathing, the clang of their footsteps, and Maya's occasional, whispered, "Be careful." The air grew colder around her, a deep, penetrating cold that felt ancient and unnatural. She hugged herself tighter, her teeth beginning to chatter. The smell of ozone was stronger now, making the hairs on her arms stand up. She shone her own light around the base of the lighthouse again. Her beam caught something she had not seen before. On the damp earth near the base of the stairs were footprints. They were not from her friends. They were small, barefoot, the footprints of a child. They were fresh. They led from the base of the stairs and ended abruptly in the middle of the room, as if the child had simply vanished into the air. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She took a step back into the cottage, her heart hammering, and then she heard it. From inside the cottage, behind her, drip, drip, drip. The sound was back, but it was not coming from the kitchen or the bathroom. It was coming from right over her head. At the same time, from the top of the lighthouse, a scream tore through the silence. It was Maya, a raw, high-pitched shriek of pure terror. It was followed by Ben yelling her name, and the frantic, clanging sound of them scrambling back down the stairs. Chloe was frozen between two unfolding horrors. The sound of her friends plummeting back towards her, and the steady, rhythmic dripping from the ceiling of the living room. Then came a sound that broke her paralysis. A deafening final slam. The main door to the cottage, the door they had entered through hours before, had just slammed shut. A heavy metallic clank followed it, the sound of a bolt being thrown. They were locked in. The others came tumbling out of the lighthouse, their faces wild with panic in the crazed dance of their flashlight beams. The door, something locked the front door. Leo screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. Ben and Maya did not even pause. They ran straight to the front door and began pulling on it, rattling the handle, shoving their shoulders against it. It did not budge. It was as solid as the stone walls around them. "What did you see?" Chloe demanded, grabbing Maya's arm. Maya flinched, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Up there," she gasped, pointing back towards the lighthouse. "At the top. The lantern room. It is all broken and open to the sky. There was a pile of rags in the corner, like a nest, and words scratched into the wall." "What did they say?" It said, "Do not listen to the song." She stammered, her whole body trembling. And there was something else in the middle of the floor. A pattern. "What kind of pattern?" Chloe pressed. Maya shook her head, tears streaming down her face. It was made of salt, a perfect spiral, just like the stones on your windowsill. A collective chill went through them. They were all thinking the same thing. The line around the house, the spiral of stones, the spiral of salt. These were not decorations. They were symbols, wards, or warnings. Drip, drip. The sound pulled their attention away from the doors, away from the lighthouse. They all looked up. In the center of the ceiling, a dark, ugly stain was spreading across the wooden planks. It was the size of a dinner plate, and it was growing. As they watched, a single, thick, black drop gathered itself, elongated, and fell, spattering on the floorboards with a wet smack. Ben cautiously approached it, shining his phone light on the droplet. It was not water. It was viscous and black, with an oily sheen, like crude oil or spoiled blood. It smelled faintly of that same sweet, metallic odor from outside. "What is that?" he whispered, a new and deeper fear in his voice. As another drop fell, the single bare light bulb that hung from the ceiling began to flicker. It buzzed erratically, its yellow light faltering, casting the room in a disorienting strobe-like effect. On, off, on, off. The room flashed between jaundiced light and absolute darkness. Each flash of light revealed their terrified faces, frozen in grotesque silent screams. On. A flash of Maya, pressed against the wall, her hands over her mouth. Off. Darkness and the sound of dripping. On. A flash of Leo, crouched on the floor, his head in his hands. Off. Darkness and the sound of their own ragged breathing. On. A flash of Ben, staring at the growing black stain on the floor. Off. Darkness. On. In the corner of the room, the one deepest in shadow, a figure stood where nothing had been a second before. It was tall, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs like the twisted branches of a dead tree. It was draped in what looked like damp, dark rags that clung to its skeletal frame. It had no discernible features, no eyes, no mouth. Its head was a smooth, pale, oblong shape, like an egg, and it was tilted slightly to the side, as if it were listening to a sound only it could hear. It was the faceless thing from the child's drawing. No one screamed. The sight was so monstrous, so utterly alien to any known reality, that it stole the air from their lungs, paralyzing their vocal cords. All they could do was stare, their minds refusing to process what their eyes were seeing. The creature did not move. It just stood there, in the strobing light, a silent, nightmarish sentinel. The flickering grew more violent. The buzzing grew louder, with a final, explosive pop. The light bulb shattered, showering the room in tiny fragments of glass. The darkness that fell was absolute. It was a physical presence, a thick, smothering blanket. The only sounds left were the steady, wet drip from the ceiling and the 4 sets of frantic, terrified heartbeats pounding in the suffocating black. They were not alone in the room. The dripping was getting faster, darkness, total and absolute. It was a physical weight, pressing in from all sides, smothering thought, leaving only pure, instinctual terror. For a moment, the only thing that existed in the universe was the frantic, slick beating of Chloe's own heart and the sound of the thick, black liquid striking the floorboards. Drip, smack, drip, smack. It was a wet, organic sound, like a wound leaking in the black. She could not breathe. Her lungs were paralyzed, her throat a knot of frozen muscle. She could hear the others, a sharp, indrawn gasp from Maya, a choked whimper that must have been Leo, the harsh, ragged panting of Ben. They were all there, inches away in the void, but they were utterly alone in their personal darkness, trapped with the memory of the impossible thing that had stood in the corner. Where was it now? The question screamed in Chloe's mind, a silent, hysterical shriek. Was it still there, a motionless blot of deeper black in the blackness? Was it moving, its silent, spindly limbs reaching for them? The lack of sound was a torment. The silence from that corner of the room was a living, predatory thing. A fumbling, scratching sound broke the spell. A frantic clicking. It was Ben, his hands shaking violently as he tried to work his phone. The clicking was a tiny, desperate anchor in the overwhelming sea of black. "Come on," he hissed, his voice a raw whisper. Then, a miracle. A brilliant, blue-white beam cut through the darkness. It was a violent intrusion, making Chloe flinch and throw a hand over her eyes. Ben wielded the light like a weapon, sweeping it wildly across the room. The beam sliced through the dust motes hanging in the air, catching the glint of shattered glass on the floor. It illuminated Leo, curled in a fetal position by the dead hearth. It caught Maya, her back so flat against the wall, it was as if she were trying to merge with the stone. It painted a slash of light across the barricaded front door and the accusing, silent door to the lighthouse. Ben swung the beam into the corner where the creature had stood. It was empty. The relief that should have come was absent. In its place was a new, colder, more intelligent fear. It was not a monster that could be seen and fought. It was a phantom, a thing that could step in and out of reality at will. The empty space was more menacing than the creature itself had been. "Where did it go?" Leo wailed, his voice muffled by his knees. "Oh God, where did it go? Everybody, lights on. Now." Ben barked, the command a thin shield for the terror that was clear in his voice. Shaky hands mimicked his actions. Soon, two more beams of light joined his, crisscrossing the room in frantic, paranoid arcs. They searched every corner, every shadow, the dark maw of the fireplace, the space under the lopsided table. The cottage was empty, except for them, and the dripping, drip, smack, drip, smack. The sound drew their beams upward, to the center of the ceiling. The ugly black stain was larger now, the size of a manhole cover. The wood around it was dark and swollen with the foul liquid. It looked cancerous, malignant. "It is coming from the loft," Maya stated, her voice unnaturally calm and steady. The shock had burned away her panic, leaving a core of cold, hard terror. "Where you two were supposed to be sleeping." Ben and Leo both looked up, a shared expression of horror on their faces. "We have to get out of this room," Maya continued, her logic a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos. "It appeared here. This room is not safe. The bedrooms. We can lock ourselves in." "Lock ourselves in," Leo sobbed, looking up at her. "It locked us in the whole house from the outside. What good is a bedroom lock? It is better than staying here, waiting for that thing to come back." She shot back, her composure cracking. A fresh wave of acrimony broke over them. Arguments fueled by terror. Accusations flew, sharp and cruel. It was Leo's fault for finding the place. It was Ben's fault for opening the lighthouse door. It was Maya's fault for insisting they go inside it. Their friendship, so effortless and easy just hours before, was dissolving in the corrosive acid of their fear. It was Chloe who stopped it. She had not spoken. She had been watching the puddle of black liquid on the floor. It was not just a puddle. It was moving. The droplets were not just soaking into the wood. They were coalescing, pulling together, the edges quivering as if with some inner life. "Stop," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It cut through their frantic shouting. "Look." She pointed her light at the floor. The others followed her beam. They watched, mesmerized, as the small black pool slowly, deliberately, began to elongate. It stretched itself into a thin, dark line, like a single, glistening tentacle. It was moving. It was crawling, inch by inch, across the floorboards. It was moving toward the staircase that led to the loft. The sight was so fundamentally wrong, so profoundly unnatural, that it silenced them all. This was not just a leak. It was a symptom of the house itself, a physical manifestation of the sickness that had taken root within its walls. "We have to see the source," Ben said, his voice a low growl. "We have to know what is up there." He was staring at the creeping line of black fluid, as if it were a snake. His fear had found a new focus. He needed to confront the source of this physical corruption. This time there was no argument. The logic was inescapable. The thing in the corner had vanished, but this was real. This was tangible, and it was leading them upstairs. The staircase was narrow and steep, tucked away in a corner of the main room. It was more like a ladder than a proper set of stairs. Ben went first, his phone held out in front of him, its beam cutting a swath through the oppressive darkness above. Maya followed, then a trembling Leo. Chloe took up the rear, her light pointed back down into the main room, her eyes scanning the shadows, terrified of what might appear behind them. The stairs creaked under their weight, a series of complaining groans that seemed deafeningly loud. The air grew colder as they ascended, and the smell of brine and decay intensified. With each step, the rhythmic dripping from below grew fainter, replaced by a new sound from above, a soft, wet, tearing sound. Ben reached the top and paused, shining his light into the loft space. It was a low-ceiling attic, the rafters thick with cobwebs that looked as old as the cottage itself. 2 bare, stained mattresses lay on the floor, their meagre offerings of bedding tossed aside. The space was small, cramped, and filled with a palpable sense of misery. The source of the dripping was immediately obvious. In the center of the loft, directly above the stain in the ceiling below, was a massive sprawling fungus. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was jet black and had the texture of wet leather. It grew out from the floorboards in a chaotic tumorous mass, pulsing with a faint internal luminescence that their lights almost washed out. It was from the countless pores on this grotesque growth that the black liquid was weeping, seeping down through the cracks in the floor. The soft tearing sound was the fungus slowly inexorably growing, its edges creeping outward across the floor. But that was not what made Maya gasp and recoil. At the far end of the loft, tucked under the eaves, was a small wooden crate. On top of it sat a book. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover warped and stained by salt and damp. It lay open, its pages ruffled by a breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. It was Ben who approached it, his steps hesitant. He shone his light on the open pages. They were filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. A journal. "What is it?" Chloe asked from the top of the stairs. "It is a diary," Ben said, his voice hushed. "A logbook from a lighthouse keeper." He reached out and carefully touched the page, then recoiled. The paper was cold and slightly damp to the touch, like skin. He picked it up. It was heavy, and it smelled of the sea and of old, deep-seated sorrow. "Bring it down," Maya said, already backing away toward the stairs. "Let us get out of this room, now." They retreated back to the main room, their descent even more fearful than their ascent. They huddled together around the lopsided table, the journal placed in the center like a holy relic. The 4 beams of their phones focused on its yellowed pages. The creeping line of black liquid had reached the bottom of the stairs and was now slowly beginning to crawl up the first step. Ben began to read aloud, his voice low and unsteady. "October 12th, 1887. We have arrived. The Saltgrim. A harsh name for a harsh place, but it is ours. The light is strong, the cottage sturdy. Ilara finds the isolation difficult, but little Anna is enchanted. She says the sea sings to her. I pray this posting will be the making of us." The handwriting in the early entries was neat and precise. The keeper, a man named Thomas Pike, wrote of storms and supply ships, of the daily routines of cleaning the great lens and winding the clockwork mechanism. He wrote of his love for his wife Ilara and his daughter Anna. It was a portrait of a simple, hard life filled with a quiet hope. Then the entries began to change. November 3rd, 1887. A strange week. The fog has not lifted for 5 days. A smothering blanket. I can no longer see the mainland. We are an island in a sea of milk. At night, Anna speaks of a new song. Not the sea's song, she says. A different one, a quiet one, that comes from the tower. I have told her it is just the wind. November 10th, 1887. The song. I hear it now too. It is not the wind. It is a melody, faint and sweet, like a music box heard from a great distance. It seems to come from the very stones of the tower. Ilara hears nothing. She says the isolation is making me fanciful. But I see the way she looks at the tower door. She feels it too. A coldness, a presence. Ben's voice faltered. He took a shaky breath and continued. The handwriting in the journal was growing less steady, the letters beginning to slant and crowd together. November 21st, 1887. Anna drew a picture today of our family, but there was another figure with us, a tall man, she said, a man with no face, the stick man. He sings the song, she told me. He is her friend. I burned the drawing. The sight of it made my blood run cold. When I asked her where she saw the stick man, she pointed. Not to the sea, not to the shore. She pointed up, to the top of the lighthouse. December 1st, 1887. It is inside the cottage now. I hear it moving in the loft at night, pacing. Ilara is sick with fear. She will not leave our room after dark. We have begun to find things, little arrangements. A spiral of shells on a windowsill, a line of dried seaweed across the doorway. Anna says they are presents from the stick man. I believe they are something else. Markers, claims. Leo let out a choked sob. Ben ignored him, his eyes glued to the page, his voice now a horrified monotone. The handwriting was a barely legible scrawl. December 15th, 1887. The name for it is the Saltgrim. It is the salt and the grim, the endless grey despair of this place. It feeds on it. It came from the sea, but it has made its nest in the tower. It wears a human shape to fool us, but it is not human. It is an emptiness that sings. It whispers things in the dark. Promises. It promised to stop the storms. It promised to heal Elara's cough. All it asks for is a voice. It wants Anna to sing with it, to finish the song. December 23rd, 1887. She is gone. Elara is gone. The supply ship found me alone. I told them she was taken by a fever, a lie. She heard the song. She went into the tower. She never came back. I have locked the door. I have put a line of salt around the cottage, as the old folklore dictates, a barrier. It cannot cross a line of pure sea salt, but the salt is damp. The line is broken. It is a prison, not a fortress. The final entry was on a new page. The handwriting was a wild, jagged slash of ink, barely recognizable as words. It has Anna's voice. It calls to me from the tower, humming her lullaby. But it is not her. Anna is with me. She is safe. She will not sing its song. I made sure. I will not let it have her voice. I will not let it finish the song. The song is the key. The song opens the door. Not the door of wood and iron. The other door. The one between the worlds. Do not listen. Do not listen to the song. The last page was blank, save for a single, large, dark brown stain, as if the book had been slammed shut on a bleeding hand. Silence. The four of them sat there, frozen, the keeper's 100-year-old horror, a fresh and living thing in the room with them, the humming, the faceless man, the spiral symbols, the warning. It was all there, a script for their own nightmare. It wants a voice, Chloe whispered, her face pale as parchment. It wanted Anna's voice. The dripping from the loft had stopped. The line of black fluid on the stairs was still. The entire cottage was utterly, deathly silent. And then it began. A faint, childish humming. It was the same simple, wandering melody they had heard from the lighthouse. But this time, it was coming from inside Chloe's bedroom. The humming was a needle of ice, stitching the four of them together in a single, shared moment of paralysis. It was a child's tune, soft and aimless, yet it carried an ancient malice. It trickled from beneath the closed door of Chloe's bedroom, a sound that had no right to be there, a poison seeping into the already toxic silence of the cottage. Chloe felt a profound and personal violation. That was her room, her space, her thin, lumpy mattress, and the small bag of clothes that represented the last vestiges of her normal life. The entity had taken it. It had curled up in the heart of her sanctuary, and was now purring like a contented predator. No one dared to move. They were statues in the cold, dusty air, their phone beams all trained on the simple, painted wooden door as if it were the gate to hell itself. The keeper's words echoed in their minds. It has Anna's voice. It calls to me from the tower, humming her lullaby. But it is not her. It is playing with us, Ben whispered, his voice a low, guttural rasp. He took a half step toward the door, his big frame tense. It is trying to scare us. Do not, Chloe said, her voice surprisingly strong. Do not go near it. We cannot just stand here and let it, he argued, though his feet remained rooted to the spot. What is it doing in there? As if in answer, the humming stopped. The sudden silence was a physical blow. They all held their breath, listening. A full minute passed. Nothing. Then, a new sound. A soft, dry scratching. Scratch, 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 scratch. It was coming from the other side of the door. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound, the sound of a fingernail being dragged slowly down the wood, over and over again, in the same spot. Leo made a sound like a dying animal, a high, thin keen that he choked back with his own hand. He was rocking back and forth on his heels, his eyes wide with a terror that bordered on madness. The scratching continued, a patient, unnerving sound that grated on their already shattered nerves. The salt, Maya said suddenly, her voice sharp and clear in the gloom. The word hung in the air. Hope, a weapon, a rule. The journal. Thomas Pike wrote that it could not cross a line of pure sea salt. Her words galvanized them. It was a plan, a tangible action in the face of the incomprehensible. The kitchen, she commanded, her analytical mind resurfacing through the layers of fear. It has to be in the kitchen. The kitchen was a small, grimy alcove at the far end of the living room. To get to it, they had to stay in the main space, exposed, with their backs to both the lighthouse door and the scratching bedroom door. It felt like an impossible journey. Okay, Ben said, taking charge. He was terrified, but he was a man of action, and action was the only antidote to this kind of fear. We all go. No one stays alone. Chloe, you and Leo keep your lights on that bedroom door. Maya, you are with me. We search the cabinets. Fast. They moved as a single, trembling unit. Chloe and Leo walked backward, their phone beams pinned to the scratching door, while Ben and Maya fumbled through the filthy cupboards. The smell of mouse droppings and old damp wood filled the air. They found rusted cans of food from a forgotten decade, a single, cracked plate, and a family of dead spiders. Scratch, 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 scratch. The sound from the bedroom door was changing. It was becoming more frantic, more insistent. It was no longer just a nail. It sounded like a whole hand, scrabbling at the wood, desperate to get out. There is nothing here, Maya cried, her voice tight with rising panic as she slammed another empty cabinet shut. Keep looking. Ben grunted, pulling open a drawer filled with tarnished, mismatched cutlery. Then, Behind them, the sound from the bedroom door stopped. The abrupt silence was terrifying. They all froze, their heads whipping around, to stare at the door. A small, high voice, thin as a whisper of smoke, curled out from the crack beneath it. "Mama," it said, "I am scared of the dark. Can you let me out?" It was the voice of a little girl, a lost, frightened little girl. It was a sound engineered to break a human heart, to bypass all logic and fear, and trigger a primal instinct to protect. Chloe felt a tear slip down her cheek. It was not Anna. It was a lure, a hook baited with the ghost of a murdered child. "Do not listen," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It is not her." "Found it," Ben said, his voice a choked gasp. He pulled a cylindrical cardboard container from the back of a high shelf. On its faded label, they could just make out the words, "Port Blossom Sea Salt." He shook it. It was half full. The child's voice came again from behind the door, more insistent now, a note of pathetic whining in its tone. "Please, the stickman is coming back. I do not want him to find me." "Let us go," Maya said, grabbing Leo by the arm and pulling him away from the door he was staring at, his face a mess of conflict and horror. "My room, now." Her bedroom was on the opposite side of the cottage, a mirror image of Chloe's. They scrambled inside, a clumsy, terrified herd, and slammed the door shut. The room was tiny, containing only a bed and a small, rickety wooden dresser. The single window was a milky grey rectangle of fog, looking out over the cliff's edge and the churning sea below. "The salt," Ben said, his voice ragged. He tore the top off the container. With a surprisingly steady hand, he began to pour a thin, unbroken line of white crystals across the wooden threshold, from one side of the doorframe to the other. The small pile of salt seemed like a pathetic, superstitious defense against the monstrous reality they were facing. However, it was all they had. When the line was complete, they shoved the dresser against the door. It scraped and shuddered, but it was another layer, another barrier. They were sealed in. For a moment, they allowed themselves to breathe. The four of them were crammed into the tiny, cold room, their phone beams creating a chaotic web of light. They were trapped, yes, but they were together, and they had created a sanctuary. The scratching and the terrible, pleading voice from the other room were gone, muffled by the closed door. Here, there was only the sound of their own breathing and the distant, eternal sigh of the sea. "It worked," Leo said, a note of hysterical relief in his voice. It actually worked. They stood in silence for several minutes, listening. Nothing. No humming. No scratching. No voices. The salt line seemed to be holding. The relief was so profound it was dizzying. They had found a rule to the nightmare. They had a weapon. "We just have to wait until morning," Maya said, her voice regaining some of its familiar authority. "We have a safe room. We just have to wait." But the cottage was not done with them. The silence did not last. It started as a vibration, a low, deep thrum that came up through the soles of their feet. It was a powerful, rhythmic pulse, like a giant, slow, beating heart, deep within the earth beneath them. The floorboards of the tiny bedroom began to tremble. The glass in the single window pane rattled in its frame. Thump, thump, thump. The pulsing grew stronger, more violent. Dust rained down from the low ceiling. The rickety dresser they had pushed against the door began to inch away from it, pushed by the vibrations. "What is that?" Leo shrieked, clutching his head. "What is happening?" The source of the sound was not in the house. It was outside. It was coming from the lighthouse. It was the sound of something immense and heavy, striking the stone walls of the tower from the inside, as if a giant were trying to batter its way out. Thump, thump, thump. With each impact, the entire cottage shuddered, and a shower of grit and plaster fell from the walls. And then, above the terrible rhythmic booming, they heard a new sound. It was the high, piercing shriek of stressed metal. It came from outside their window, from the top of the lighthouse. Ben was the first to realize what it was. His face went white. "The lantern," he breathed. "The broken metal at the top of the tower. Something is pulling it apart." They all turned to look at the window, a rectangle of pale, swirling grey. As they watched, a shadow fell across it, a long, impossibly thin shadow. It was a shape that did not belong in the natural world. It was the shadow of a spindly, claw-like arm, reaching down from the top of the lighthouse stump. They stared, mesmerized with horror, as the shadow moved. It was dragging itself along the outside of the cottage wall. They could hear it now, a wet, heavy, dragging sound, punctuated by the sharp scrape of something hard against the stone. It was coming for the window. Chloe backed away until her shoulders hit the far wall. She could not take her eyes off the grey pane of glass. It was the only thing separating them from the creature. The salt line at the door was useless. It had never been trying to get in through the door. It had been a diversion. It was a game. The dragging sound stopped. The shadow outside the window solidified into a definite shape. It was a silhouette. The shape was a head and a pair of narrow shoulders framed against the fog. The head was long and smooth without features, tilted at that same inquisitive bird-like angle. It was the stick man. It was the Saltgrim. It was right outside their window. They were on the second floor, perched on the edge of a sheer cliff. Nothing could be standing there. For a long, silent moment, it just watched them, a motionless blot of darkness against the grey. They could feel its ancient, malevolent intelligence studying them through the glass. Then a hand rose into view. It was not a hand. It was a nightmare. Long, pale fingers, like a collection of sharpened bones, were held together by slick grey ligaments. There were too many joints. The fingers bent at impossible angles. The hand came to rest against the window pane. There was no sound, but Chloe could imagine the cold, damp feel of it against the glass. And then it tapped, a single, sharp, articulate tap. Tap. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the silent, trembling room. It was a polite, patient sound, a request for entry. The four of them were trapped. Their sanctuary had become a cage. The salt line was a joke, and the monster was at the window, asking to be let in. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was delicate, almost polite. It was a sound that should have been accompanied by a friendly face, a visitor on a rainy afternoon. Instead, it was the sound of a nightmare knocking patiently at the door of their reality. The long bone-white fingers, each with too many joints, rested on the glass like a giant, desiccated insect. The featureless, egg-like head tilted, listening, waiting for a heartbeat. All they could do was stare. Their minds, overloaded with terror, had simply shut down. They were trapped in a tiny room with a monster at the window, a monster that defied gravity, that was built from the spare parts of a spider's dream. Ben was the one who broke. The paralysis shattered, replaced by a surge of pure, primal fury. It was the desperate rage of a cornered animal. With a roar that was more animal than human, he lunged across the tiny room and grabbed the heaviest thing he could find, the rickety wooden dresser they had shoved against the door. "Get away from the window!" he screamed, his voice cracking under the strain as he heaved the piece of furniture. His movement was the spark that ignited the others. Chloe and Maya scrambled backward, pressing themselves into the corner by the door, as far from the window as possible. Leo, however, was frozen. He stood in the middle of the room, his face a slack mask of catatonic horror, his eyes fixed on the tapping fingers. Crack. The sound was sharp and crystalline. A spiderweb of fractures instantly appeared on the window pane where the creature's finger had tapped. It had not used force. The glass had simply surrendered, as if its very molecular structure had failed in the presence of such an unnatural thing. The creature's hand pushed forward, and the fractured glass dissolved into a cascade of shimmering fragments that tinkled onto the floorboards. Cold, foul-smelling air, thick with the scent of brine and something else, something like old blood, flooded the room. A single, impossibly long arm snaked into the room. It was not covered in skin, but in a slick, grey membrane that glistened like wet stone. It moved with a disjointed, unnatural fluidity, its multi-jointed fingers flexing and unflexing, searching the air. "Leo, move!" Maya screamed, her voice a raw shriek. But Leo was lost. He stared at the questing, skeletal fingers as they drew nearer, his mouth hanging open in a silent O of disbelief. Ben gave up on the dresser. It was too heavy, too clumsy. He changed tactics, grabbing one of the small wooden drawers he had pulled out and flung it at the window. It was a pathetic gesture, a child throwing a toy. The drawer struck the creature's arm with a hollow thud and clattered uselessly to the floor. The arm did not even flinch. It was reaching for Leo. The pale, sharp fingers were just inches from his face. Chloe saw it happen in a series of slow-motion, stop-motion frames. She saw the creature's fingers brush against Leo's cheek. She saw his eyes widen, not in fear anymore, but in a kind of awful, final understanding. She saw a faint, grey mist rise from Leo's skin where the creature touched him, as if it were drawing the warmth, the very life, out of him. He did not scream, he simply folded. His body went limp, his knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. The arm retracted, pulling back out of the window. For a second, There was only the empty black hole of the broken pane and the sight of Leo's still form on the floor. He is, Maya stammered, unable to finish the sentence. They did not have time to process it. With a sound of screaming, tearing metal and splintering wood, the entire window frame was ripped from the stone wall. The creature was coming in. "The door, now!" Ben yelled, grabbing Chloe and Maya and shoving them out of the room. They stumbled over their own feet, a panicked, clumsy tangle of limbs. Ben slammed the bedroom door shut behind them, the sound of the monster forcing its grotesque body through the window frame echoing in the hallway. They were back in the main room. It was no safer. The darkness was thick and alive. The black fungal growth from the loft had spread, crawling down the walls in thick, pulsating veins. The air was heavy and cold, and the dripping sound had started again, a steady, maddening rhythm from a dozen different places at once. They ran for the front door, the locked, bolted front door. It was pure instinct, a flight toward a hope of escape that they all knew was false. Ben threw his shoulder against it. It was like hitting a wall of solid rock. "It is no good," he gasped, staggering back. A sound from behind them made them all spin around. It was a wet, dragging sound, followed by a series of sharp, cracking noises, like dry branches being snapped. The Saltgrim was coming out of the bedroom, but it was not walking. It was crawling on the ceiling. Its form was fully revealed now in the frantic, dancing beams of their phone lights. It was a blasphemy of anatomy. Its torso was small and emaciated, but its limbs were grotesquely elongated. 4 spindly, multi-jointed legs, and 2 arms that were even longer, all of which terminated in those same needle-like fingers. It moved like a broken insect, its limbs scuttling across the ceiling in a horrifying, disjointed rhythm, its featureless head hanging down, swiveling from side to side. It was a spider made of bone and shadow. They backed away, a slow, terrified retreat. Their phone lights wavered, creating a strobe effect that made the creature's movements seem even more jerky and unnatural. It was in no hurry. It was savoring their terror. It owned this place. It owned them. It unfolded one of its long arms, letting it drop from the ceiling until the tip of its fingers brushed the floor. Then it began to crawl toward them, its body clinging to the ceiling while its arms swept across the floorboards, herding them. They were being pushed back toward the cold fireplace, back toward the silent, accusing door of the lighthouse. The humming started again. It came from the creature, a low, guttural vibration that they could feel in their bones. It was the same child's lullaby, but it was deeper now, distorted, filled with a resonant, malevolent power. It was a song of despair. Chloe felt it wash over her, a wave of absolute hopelessness. The journal's words screamed in her mind. It feeds on it. It was not just going to kill them. It was feasting on their fear first. Maya stumbled, tripping over the leg of the lopsided table. She fell hard, her phone skittering away across the floor, its light spinning crazily into a dark corner. Ben lunged to help her, pulling her to her feet, his body a shield between her and the creature. They were cornered. The fireplace was at their backs, the creature before them, its arms sweeping closer. The song is the key, Thomas Pike had written. It wants a voice to finish the song. The creature's humming grew louder, more insistent. It was not just a sound. It was a question. It was an invitation. The melody had a gap in it, a missing piece that begged to be filled. Chloe felt an insane, terrifying urge to hum along, to complete the phrase. The sound was hypnotic, pulling at her, promising an end to the fear, a quiet, grey peace. She looked at Ben, his face grim, his knuckles white as he held up a uselessly small, rusted fire poker. She looked at Maya, her face streaked with tears, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. She thought of Leo, lying silent and still in the other room, and something inside her broke. It was not despair. It was rage. A pure, white-hot, incandescent rage. Rage at this thing, this parasite that had fed on a family's sorrow 100 years ago and was now trying to feed on theirs. Rage at this place, this trap of rock and sea and memory. The creature's humming reached its questioning note, the empty space in the melody hanging in the air. It was waiting for one of them to break, to give in, to lend it their voice. Chloe opened her mouth, but it was not the lullaby that came out. It was a scream. It was not a scream of fear. It was a sound of pure, raw, undiluted fury. It was all the terror, all the grief for Leo, all the hopeless desperation of their situation, transmuted into a single, defiant, human sound. It was a jagged, ugly, wordless roar that clawed its way out of her throat. It was the antithesis of the creature's song. The lullaby was a melody of despair and surrender. Her scream was a cacophony of life and defiance. The effect was immediate and stunning. The creature flinched, its entire body convulsed on the ceiling, its limbs spasming. The humming cut off with a wet, gurgling static. Its featureless head snapped up, focusing on Chloe. The silent, empty space where its face should have been seemed to radiate a sense of profound shock and pain. It was vulnerable to the sound, not to noise but to the emotion behind it. Its song of despair could be broken by a sound of pure rage. The creature recoiled, its long limbs pulling back. Its form seemed to flicker, its edges blurring for a second, as if her scream had momentarily disrupted the energy that held its physical form together. "That is it," Maya gasped, her eyes wide with a dawning frantic hope. "The sound. Fight the sound." The creature let out a hiss, a sound like steam escaping a cracked boiler, and dropped from the ceiling. It landed on the floor in a crouch, a tangle of grey limbs and shadow. It was wounded, but it was still deadly. It gathered itself, preparing to lunge. They had a moment, an instant. Ben did not waste it. With a guttural yell that echoed Chloe's own, he charged forward, plunging the iron fire poker like a spear. He was not aiming for a vital organ. The thing probably did not have any. He was aiming for its head. The poker struck the smooth, egg-like head with a bizarre ringing sound, like striking a block of cold, hard ceramic. It did not pierce it, but the force of the blow sent the creature staggering backward. It was their chance, their only chance. "The lighthouse," Chloe screamed, grabbing Maya's arm. "What? Are you crazy?" Maya cried, trying to pull back. "The journal. The light is strong. It is the only other weapon we have." There was no time to argue. Ben was already backing away from the creature, which was shaking its head slowly, recovering. They ran, not for the locked front door, but for the other one, the one that had started it all, the door to the lighthouse. Ben reached it first and tore at the handle. It swung open into that familiar, absolute darkness. They plunged through into the cold, damp air and the smell of wet earth. They did not slam the door behind them. They knew it would be useless. They could hear the creature scrabbling across the floor of the cottage, coming after them. They were inside the monster's nest. They had fled the trap and entered the lair. Their only hope lay somewhere above them, at the top of the rusted spiral stairs, in the broken lightless lantern room. The darkness inside the lighthouse tower was a different kind of darkness. It was older, colder and hollow. Their frantic footsteps and ragged breaths echoed in the tight cylindrical space, spiraling upward into nothing. The only light came from the single wavering beam of Chloe's phone, as Ben and Maya had lost theirs in the chaos. It was a tiny, fragile spear of light against a primordial black. Behind them, a sound that would haunt their dreams forever. The sharp, scrabbling click of the Saltgrim's bony feet on the stone floor of the cottage, followed by a wet, dragging noise as it pulled its grotesque body through the doorway into the tower. It was coming. Go, 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 Ben yelled, his voice a raw bark of command. He was at the rear, shoving Chloe and Maya ahead of him up the narrow, rusted spiral staircase that clung to the curved wall. The iron railing was cold and slick with damp, crumbling under their desperate grip. Each step groaned in protest, a chorus of metallic shrieks that was almost drowned out by the thunderous booming of the storm outside and the frantic, slick beat of their own hearts. Chloe risked a glance down. She saw nothing but the swirling dust motes in her light beam, but she could hear it. A rhythmic, multi-limbed scrabbling on the stone steps below them. It was climbing, and it was fast. They scrambled upward, their legs burning, their lungs on fire. The tower was a vertical tomb, and they were racing the devil to the top. The air grew colder, thinner, tasting of ozone and ancient wet stone. The windows they passed were not windows but narrow slits, like arrow loops in a fortress, offering no escape, only brief, strobe-lit glimpses of the churning black sea below as lightning tore across the sky. The creature's humming started again, rising from the darkness below them. It was no longer a lullaby. It was a low, resonant thrum of pure hatred, a vibration that seemed to shake the very stones of the tower. It pressed in on them, a psychic weight trying to crush their spirits, to make their legs give out, to make them simply stop and wait for the end. "Do not listen," Chloe shouted, her own voice sounding thin and reedy against the sound. "Sing. Yell. Anything." Ben took up the call, letting out a wordless roar of defiance. Maya, catching on, started screaming, not in fear, but in rage, her voice sharp and piercing. Chloe screamed with them, a chaotic, desperate, human noise to counter the monster's song of despair. They were a trio of raw, defiant sound, and it worked. The crushing pressure eased, and the creature's humming wavered, laced with a sound like furious static. They reached the top, bursting through a final, arching doorway into the lantern room. It was a cage of broken glass and rusted iron, open to the raging sky. The great lamp that should have been the heart of the structure was a shattered wreck of brass and crystal, its thick lenses cracked and milky. Rain and sea spray lashed in through the dozen broken panes, and the wind howled through the space with the voice of a banshee. In the centre of the room, somehow largely intact, was the colossal primary lens assembly, a beehive of thick, prismatic glass held in a massive brass frame. It was dark and dead. "There is nothing here," Maya cried, her voice whipped away by the wind. "It is a dead end." Hope, so fragile and new, died in an instant. Chloe's desperate gamble on the keeper's words had led them to a trap. They were cornered, 100 feet in the air, with nowhere left to run. The scrabbling sound reached the doorway. The Saltgrim flowed into the lantern room. It unfolded itself to its full, terrifying height, its head nearly scraping the domed iron ceiling. It was a thing of impossible angles and disjointed limbs, a silhouette of black against the storm-lit grey of the sky. The rain slicked its grey membrane, making it glisten. It took a slow, deliberate step into the room, its featureless head tilting, savouring their final, trapped terror. Ben moved to stand in front of the women, his fists clenched, his body a trembling wall of defiance. "You want us," he roared into the wind, his voice a challenge to the storm and the monster. "You will have to take us." The creature responded, its long sweeping arm lashing out with the speed of a striking snake. Ben threw himself to the side, and the creature's needle-like fingers struck the iron wall with a shower of sparks. This was it, the end. But as another bolt of lightning illuminated the sky, Chloe saw it. For a fraction of a second, the entire lantern room was bathed in brilliant white light, and in that instant she saw the massive lens, not as a dead thing, but as a living one. The lightning's power had been caught, focused, and for a split second, a single needle-thin beam of pure white light had projected from the lens, burning a tiny smoking black spot on the iron floor. The light is strong. It was not the lamp, it was the lens. The lens was the weapon. "The lens," she screamed, pointing. "The lightning. We need to get it in front of the lens." Maya's eyes followed her finger, and her sharp mind grasped the insane, impossible logic of it in a heartbeat. "Ben, to the center. We have to force it back." The Saltgrim was coming for them again, but now they had a purpose, a final, desperate strategy. They moved, not away from the monster, but towards it, armed with nothing but their voices and their bodies. They became a single unit of defiance. They screamed, shouted, roared. Every curse, every memory of sunlight, every ounce of their will to live was poured into the sound. They flapped their arms, making themselves bigger, a chaotic, unpredictable storm of human fury. The creature hesitated. It was built to feed on quiet despair, not to fight this chaotic, aggressive rage. It was confused by their advance, by the sheer, illogical violence of their emotions, it took a step back, its long limbs bunching together. "Now," Chloe shrieked. Ben charged, not with a weapon, but with his own body. He slammed his shoulder into the creature's narrow torso. It was like hitting a wall of cold, damp stone, but the impact, combined with the psychic assault of their screams, was enough. The Saltgrim staggered backward, its spindly legs tripping over the wreckage on the floor. It stumbled directly into the focal point of the great lens. For a moment, nothing happened. The creature regained its balance, its featureless head swiveling between the three of them. It let out a low, hissing hiss of fury. Its arm rose, ready for a final, killing strike. They stood before it, exposed and defenseless, their fates now in the hands of the storm. They waited. The moment stretched into an eternity. The wind howled, the rain fell, and then the world turned white. A bolt of lightning, thicker and more brilliant than any before, struck the iron conducting rod at the pinnacle of the lighthouse roof. For a single, silent, crystalline heartbeat, a torrent of raw celestial energy poured down into the lantern room. The great lens drank the fire from the sky, and it gave it back. A beam of pure incandescent energy, as thick as a man's arm and brighter than the sun, erupted from the lens and struck the Saltgrim dead center. The creature did not scream. The sound it made was a violation of physics, a high-frequency tearing sound as its unnatural form was violently unmade. It did not burn, it simply dissolved. The psychic song of despair that had saturated the very stones of the place ended in a final deafening chord of static. Its body, the construct of shadow and salt and sorrow, was ripped apart. The grey membrane turned to steam, the bone-like structure to black, crystalline dust. For a brief second, they saw a swirling vortex of seawater and shadow where its torso had been, and then it was all scoured away by the light. The beam of light vanished as the thunderclap finally hit, a physical blow that shook the tower to its foundations and threw them all to the floor. And then, silence. Not the predatory, listening silence of before. This was a true silence, deep and clean, broken only by the sound of the wind and the rain and their own ragged, sobbing breaths. It was over. They lay on the floor for a long time, amid the shattered glass and the wreckage, as the storm slowly spent its fury. As the wind died down and the rain softened to a drizzle, the first tentative fingers of dawn began to touch the horizon. A pale, clean light crept into the lantern room, painting the world in soft shades of grey and rose. Slowly, painfully, they got to their feet. They were bruised, battered and hollowed out. They looked at each other, their faces streaked with grime and tears. There were no words. They simply stood together, a triangle of survivors, and watched the sun rise over the sea. They made their way down the spiral stairs in the growing light of morning. The tower no longer felt malevolent, merely old and sad. The cottage was just a derelict building, the black fungus on the walls now a dry, crumbling husk that flaked away at a touch. The front door, which had been an unbreakable barrier, swung open easily. They stepped outside into the clean, salt-scrubbed air of a new day. In the distance, across a stretch of calm grey water, They could see the faint, hazy line of the mainland. It was real. It was waiting for them. They did not look back at the lighthouse, the salt-scoured stone, grim and silent in the morning light. They would carry its shadow with them for the rest of their lives. They had survived the nightmare, but they knew, with a certainty that was now etched into their souls, that they would never truly leave the Saltgrim behind.